In the scorching haze of a Middle Eastern outpost where sand stung the skin and trust was as scarce as shade, Samantha Tran moved like a shadow herself. A 38-year-old Vietnamese-American logistics clerk, she was the woman no one noticed. Her days spent sorting supplies, her presence fading into the hum of routine. They called her the Quartermaster's widow, a cruel nickname whispered behind her back, mocking her quiet demeanor in solitary work. But beneath her unassuming surface burned a secret that could unravel everything. Samantha was no ordinary clerk. Once known as Fox Echo 6, a legendary strategist whose name sent shivers through enemy ranks, she had buried her past deep. Yet, when an ambushed convoy and a chilling enemy transmission call her by that long-forgotten name, the truth begins to surface. Who is this woman who carries the weight of a hidden war in her steady hands? And what secrets does she still guard in the silence of her heart? Samantha Tran, a quiet logistics clerk, hides a lethal past as Fox Echo 6, a legendary strategist. Mocked by peers like Lieutenant Morrison for her unassuming role, she's dismissed as the quartermaster's widow. When her name appears on a tactical deployment list, ridicule turns to shock. An ambushed convoy, predicted by Samantha, fails due to Morrison's arrogance. Leading a small team, she outmaneuvers the enemy using a hand-drawn map. A chilling enemy radio transmission reveals her true identity, sparking fear among foes. Who is this mysterious woman, and what secrets does she still conceal? If Samantha Tran's story of silent strength inspires you, support our channel. Subscribe to our channel for more tales of unsung heroes who shape history from the shadows. Comment enemy if you believe a warrior's worth is proven by their enemy's fear. Join us for more. In the blistering heat of a Middle Eastern outpost, where sand clung to every surface and the air was thick with tension, Samantha Tran moved through her days with the quiet precision of a ghost. At 38, she was a Vietnamese-American logistics clerk, her official role as unremarkable as the faded clipboard she carried. Her job was to manage the intricate web of supply chains, transportation, storage, security, for the special operations unit stationed at this unforgiving base. It was grunt work, the kind that kept the machine running but never earned a spotlight. To the young soldiers around her, she was invisible, just another cog in the military's grinding wheel. The outpost was a man's world, where competence was measured by swagger and scars, and women, if they were noticed at all, were expected to stay behind desks, far from the pulse of strategy or combat. Samantha didn't challenge that perception. She didn't need to. Her silence was her armor, her efficiency, her shield. She handed out rations, updated transport logs, and tracked ammunition counts with a methodical grace that went unnoticed. She had mastered the art of fading into the background, her presence as unassuming as the desert dust. The soldiers had a nickname for her, the Quartermaster's widow. It was a jab, born from her solemn demeanor and the way she never cracked a smile at their crude humor. They saw her as a figure of quiet grief, a woman who carried an unspoken loss, though none could guess what a mere supply clerk might have lost. "Hey, widow!" Lieutenant Morrison, a brash young officer with a grin that screamed overconfidence, would call out during meal distributions. "Got any thrilling tales from the warehouse? Tell us about the high-stakes world of inventory." His buddies would snicker, tossing back their heads as they grabbed their rations. Samantha would slide the trays across the counter, her face a blank canvas, as if his words were nothing more than the hum of a distant generator. She never flinched, never fired back. But beneath that carefully curated calm, there were flickers, moments when the woman she used to be bled through the cracks. One morning during a briefing in the cramped command tent, Lieutenant Morrison stood before a map, chest puffed out, presenting a new supply route he'd devised. He boasted it would shave 15 minutes off transport time, a victory he was sure would earn him a nod from the higher-ups. As he spoke, Samantha passed by, her arms full of supply reports. She paused, her eyes flicking to the map for no more than 3 seconds. "That road cuts through a canyon with 3 perfect ambush spots," she said, her voice low, almost an afterthought. 15 minutes isn't worth losing a whole convoy." Morrison's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "Thanks for the tactical genius, supply girl," he said, waving her off. "Stick to counting bullets." The room chuckled, but Samantha didn't react. She turned and walked away, her footsteps soft against the packed dirt floor. What Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her words weren't guesswork. They came from a place buried deep, a past erased from every official record. Samantha Tran hadn't always been a logistics clerk. Years ago, she'd been something else entirely. Fox Echo 6, a code name whispered in the shadows of classified special operations. Her service in that elite unit had been wiped from existence, her file reduced to blacked-out lines for reasons no one at this outpost could access. When Colonel Hayes, the base's commanding officer, received her transfer papers, he'd stared at the sparse document in confusion. Most of it was redacted, leaving only her name, her current clearance level, and a cryptic line, transferred by direct order of Pentagon, strategic operations, classification level, compartmentalized. It was a puzzle with no edges, a directive from so high up the chain it gave Hayes pause. He didn't ask questions. Men in his position knew better than to pry into Pentagon orders. But the mystery of Samantha Tran lingered in his mind. Who was this woman, and why was her past cloaked in such secrecy? To the untrained eye, Samantha was a model of routine. She arrived 15 minutes early each morning, her movements as predictable as the sunrise. She completed her task with surgical precision, checking inventories, mapping supply routes, ensuring every crate and bullet was accounted for, then left exactly on time. She didn't volunteer for extra shifts, didn't grumble about the endless paperwork, didn't seek praise or camaraderie. But to those who paid attention, there were hints of something more. The way her eyes scanned terrain maps with the instinct of a hunter, as if she'd walked those hostile paths herself. The way she anticipated supply demands for missions she wasn't briefed on. Her predictions eerily accurate. And then there was the day the enemy's radio crackled to life, broadcasting a question that sent a chill through the command tent. Is Fox Echo 6 on site? The soldiers exchanged glances, confused, but Samantha's heart skipped a beat. That name was a ghost from her past, a secret no one here was supposed to know. The outpost buzzed with questions. Who was this woman, and why did the enemy's voice tremble at the mention of her code name? Samantha didn't offer answers. She returned to her desk, her face as unreadable as ever, and resumed her work. But in the quiet of her mind, memories stirred, flashes of covert missions, of decisions made in the dark, of a life she'd been forced to leave behind. She didn't know who had spoken her code name over the radio, but she knew one thing. The past she'd buried was clawing its way back to the surface. In the quiet hum of the logistics office, Samantha Tran, a 38-year-old Vietnamese-American clerk, moved with the precision of a metronome, her hands sorting supply requisitions with practiced ease. To the soldiers around her, she was just another cog in the military machine, a woman who knew her way around inventories and manifests. But beneath her unassuming exterior burned a secret that could shift the tides of their operations. Samantha was no ordinary clerk. She was once Fox Echo 6, a legendary special operations strategist whose name was whispered only in the most classified circles. Her past was a shadow, invisible to her colleagues, who dismissed her uncanny grasp of tactical communications protocols as mere trivia picked up from years around the base. They had no inkling that the woman ensuring their ammo crates arrived on time was poised to become the linchpin of their entire mission. One crisp morning, the command board displayed the deployment list for an emergency briefing, and there, at position 6 on the Special Operations Support Team, was Samantha's name. A logistics clerk on the tactical roster. It was unheard of. Lieutenant Morrison, a brash young officer with a swagger that bordered on arrogance, couldn't contain his amusement. His laughter echoed through the briefing room, sharp and mocking. What's she gonna do out there? Bury the enemy in paperwork? Or maybe fetch our coffee in the field? He sneered, his voice thick with condescension. Another soldier joined in, chuckling. Think handing out rucksacks makes her a map reader now? Their taunts hung in the air, but Samantha didn't flinch. Her face remained a mask of calm, her eyes fixed on the documents she gathered with methodical care, as if their words were nothing more than background noise. That same day, the unit deployed to a forward operating base under siege, its supply lines crippled by enemy attacks. The situation was dire. Without critical provisions, the outpost would collapse within 48 hours. Morrison, ever confident in his own tactical genius, insisted on a shortcut for the supply convoy, a route he boasted would shave 15 minutes off the journey. Samantha had quietly warned against it, her voice steady but firm, pointing out vulnerabilities in the terrain. Morrison dismissed her with a wave of his hand, his tone dripping with superiority. "We're taking my route," he declared, chest puffed out. "Time is everything here. We don't have minutes ordinances for your cautious detours." As Samantha had foreseen, the convoy rolled straight into an ambush at the precise choke point she'd flagged. Explosions tore through the line, 3 vehicles were reduced to smoldering wrecks, and several soldiers were wounded. The mission unraveled into chaos, forcing an abort. Morrison's shortcut had become a catastrophic failure, his confidence shattered as he scrambled to radio for backup, his voice cracking as he tried to justify the disaster to command. Amid the pandemonium, Samantha moved with quiet resolve. Without drawing attention, she gathered a small team and led them along an alternate route she'd mapped in her mind, drawn from memory rather than any GPS or official chart. Her hand-sketched map, scratched out on a scrap of paper, seemed to materialize from nowhere, guiding them through rugged terrain that skirted every known enemy position. Her team delivered the critical supplies to the outpost, saving it from collapse, while Morrison's failure echoed in the background. The return journey brought a moment that would haunt the soldiers in that vehicle. As they drove in tense silence, a strange transmission crackled over their comms, cutting through the static like a blade. The voice, accented and unmistakably hostile, spoke on a secure military frequency. "Fox Echo 6, we know you're out there. Think you can pull the same tricks again? Show yourself." The words hung like a storm cloud in the cramped cabin. Every soldier froze, their breaths catching in their throats. Morrison's hands trembled on the steering wheel, his earlier bravado replaced by a dawning dread. The enemy wasn't broadcasting blindly. They were calling out a code name buried in classified files, a name none of these soldiers should have known existed. Slowly, Morrison turned to Samantha, his face drained of color, realization creeping into his wide eyes. "What? What did they just say?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha held his gaze for a long, heavy moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out a worn, damaged piece of identification. The card was tattered, half of it torn away, the remaining text obscured by thick black marker. But in the corner, stark and unmistakable, were the letters F06, and beneath them, in smaller print, the words Strategic Operations, Classification, Compartmentalized. Morrison stared at the card, his mind racing to reconcile the unassuming clerk with the ghost of Fox Echo 6. You're Fox Echo 6? He managed, his voice faltering. Samantha's eyes met his, steady and unyielding. "Was," she corrected softly, her tone carrying the weight of a past she'd tried to leave behind. Samantha Tran, a 38-year-old Vietnamese-American logistics clerk, moved through the military base with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being overlooked. Her days were filled with spreadsheets, supply requisitions, and the mundane hum of bureaucracy. But beneath her unassuming exterior lay a past that none of her colleagues could have imagined. A past where she was known as Fox Echo 6, a special operations strategist whose name was whispered in awe and fear. She had left that life behind, or so she thought, trading covert missions for a desk job. Yet the weight of her former identity clung to her like a shadow, invisible to her allies but glaringly obvious to her enemies. Lieutenant Morrison, a brash young officer with a penchant for underestimating those around him, had made Samantha the target of his dismissive jibes. Her meticulous reports were overkill, her warnings about ambush, vulnerabilities, paranoid. To him, she was just a clerk, a paper pusher who didn't belong in the field. His arrogance blinded him to the truth, and he wasn't alone. Her teammates scoffed at her attention to detail, mistaking her precision for obsession. But Samantha didn't flinch. She filed her reports, offered her tactical insights, and watched as they were ignored, her calm exterior masking the storm of memories she kept buried. In the back of a dusty military vehicle, a young soldier, barely out of training, leaned forward, his voice low with reverence. "Fox Echo 6, he murmured to his squad mate. "My instructor at Special Ops School said that name belonged to a legend, Someone who could cripple entire enemy battalions with nothing but clever lies and a chokehold on their supply lines. They didn't even need a weapon. The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief and awe. Morrison, sitting up front, felt his stomach lurch, his face drained of color, shifting from pale to a sickly green as the realization hit him. Every snide remark, every condescending laugh, every moment he'd brushed off Samantha's advice now felt like a noose tightening around his career. He'd been mocking a ghost, a strategic genius who'd been hiding in plain sight. The radio crackled, slicing through the tension. An enemy voice, sharp and urgent, broke through the static. "We remember Recurve 17. We know what you did to our supply lines. Come out and face us properly this time." The words were a taunt, a challenge, and a chilling confirmation that Samantha's past was far from dead. Her enemies hadn't forgotten her. They knew her code name, her tactics, her legacy. Morrison's hands trembled as he clutched the radio, his bravado crumbling. Without a word, Samantha reached over, her movements deliberate, and took the radio from him. For the first time since anyone on the base had known her, she spoke into it. A faint, unsettling smile curved her lips, not warm but sharp, like the edge of a blade. "Tell your commander," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Fox Echo 6 retired 9 years ago. You're dealing with a logistics clerk now. But if you're eager for a lesson in strategic warfare, I'd be happy to arrange a refresher." She clicked off the radio and handed it back to Morrison, who stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Her gaze was steady, unyielding, and it stripped away every assumption he'd ever made about her. "Drive," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And next time someone offers you tactical advice about ambush positions, maybe listen." The vehicle fell silent, the air thick with unspoken questions and newfound respect. The soldiers inside exchanged glances, their perception of the unassuming clerk shattered. Samantha wasn't just good at her job. She was something far more dangerous, a force none of them had been prepared to reckon with. Her teammates had mocked her paperwork. Her officers had dismissed her warnings, but they'd been wrong. She wasn't invisible, not to her enemies. They always knew exactly who she was, tracking her with a mix of fear and grudging respect. When your allies doubt you, but your enemies call you by name, who truly understands your worth? The base snapped into high alert after the intercepted transmission revealed the enemy's knowledge of classified American operational code names. The implications were staggering. A potential intelligence leak, or worse, the presence of enemy forces who had survived encounters with America's most secretive operations. Samantha was summoned to the strategy room, where chaos reigned. Officers argued over outdated maps and conflicting reports, their voices rising in frustration. Unfazed, Samantha set to work, her hands moving with quiet precision. Using nothing but paper and pencils, she began constructing a three-dimensional model of the terrain, her fingers tracing ridges and valleys from memory. Every possible attack route, every choke point, every vulnerability, she marked them all with an accuracy that silenced the room. Colonel Hayes, the commanding officer, watched her work with growing astonishment. "How do you know the topography so precisely?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he studied the intricate model. "Those elevation details aren't in any of our current maps." Samantha didn't look up, her focus unwavering. "Because I helped map it 9 years ago," she replied, her voice steady. "Some things don't change. The enemy's still using the same tactical playbook they did back then." She reached into her worn backpack, the same one she carried to work every day, and pulled out items that didn't belong in a logistics clerk's possession. Bloodstained maps covered in cryptic notations, a coding system that baffled the younger officers, a small, outdated communication device, and a field manual stamped with Operation Recurve 17. Eyes only. The room fell silent, the weight of her past settling over everyone like a storm cloud. Morrison, still reeling, found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "What was Recurve 17?" he asked, his earlier arrogance replaced by something closer to awe. Samantha paused, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "It was a strategic deception," she said, her tone measured, but carrying the weight of memory. "We neutralized 3 enemy battalions without firing a single shot. False intelligence about American troop movements led them to abandon their supply lines. leaving them stranded and ineffective. Her words were calm, but they carried the gravity of someone who had orchestrated chaos and walked away unscathed. Around her, the room buzzed with new energy. Sergeant Rodriguez scribbled furiously, compiling Samantha's tactical insights. Private Chen, tasked with researching Operation Recurve 17, dug through classified archives, piecing together fragments of her legend. Sergeant Martinez, eager to learn, hovered nearby, absorbing every detail of her terrain analysis techniques. Even Colonel Hayes, a man hardened by years of command, couldn't hide his respect. And somewhere in the shadows of bureaucracy, an unnamed civilian official slipped her an old field chronometer, a relic from her past, a silent acknowledgement of who she'd been. Samantha didn't need their validation. She'd spent years bearing Fox Echo 6, but her enemies hadn't forgotten. They feared her, and in their fear lay the truest measure of her worth. In the dimly lit briefing room, Colonel Hayes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the intricate paper model on the table. Samantha Tran, a 38-year-old Vietnamese-American logistics clerk, stood calmly beside it, her hands steady as she pointed to a series of carefully marked positions. The model depicted enemy forces stationed in tactically vulnerable locations, a setup that seemed almost too perfect. "And you?" Hayes said, his voice low but intense. "Were the strategic coordinator for this operation?" Samantha's response was quiet, almost understated, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "I was the operation," she said simply. "Fox Echo 6 wasn't a team designation. It was my individual call sign for deep cover strategic warfare." The air grew thick with disbelief. Every officer in the room froze, their minds scrambling to process the revelation. For 8 months, Samantha had been the unassuming woman, serving coffee, organizing supply inventories, and quietly enduring the dismissive attitudes of her colleagues. Now her words reshaped their understanding of her. Lieutenant Morrison, a brash young officer who had often scoffed at her suggestions, looked as though the ground had shifted beneath him. His face paled, and his usual swagger was replaced by a stunned, almost nauseated expression. "Ma'am," Morrison stammered, his voice cracking with regret, "all those things I said, I had no idea." Samantha cut him off, her tone firm but not unkind. "If you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently. You would have deferred to my opinions instead of learning to think strategically for yourself. When you ignored my advice about the convoy route, you learned a harder but more valuable lesson than any lecture I could have given." She turned back to the paper model, her finger tracing a series of marks she'd drawn with precision. "The enemy knows I'm here," she continued, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "They recognize my tactical signature. The route I used to bypass their ambush today was a maneuver I executed during Operation Recurve 17. They're not hunting Fox Echo 6 for revenge. They're hunting me because they're terrified I'll outmaneuver them again." Colonel Hayes studied the model, his brow furrowed as he absorbed the implications. "Ashtem, what do you recommend?" he asked, his tone indicating he was ready to trust her judgment. Samantha's eyes met his, unwavering. "Give me permission to run a classic Fox Echo operation. Let me feed the enemy false intelligence about our supply vulnerabilities. Make them believe our logistics are in disarray when in reality, they're secure. They'll overextend themselves, chasing weaknesses that don't exist." Hayes raised an eyebrow, but Samantha's expression shifted. For the first time, her calm demeanor gave way to a predatory smile, the kind that hinted at years of patience and calculation. "And if it doesn't work?" Hayes pressed. "It will work," she replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had spent nearly a decade refining her craft. "They're not fighting a logistics clerk anymore. They're facing someone who's been perfecting her strategies for 9 years." Within the hour, the operation was greenlit. Samantha took personal command of a decoy supply mission, deliberately using communication protocols she knew the enemy would intercept. With meticulous care, she fed them fabricated details about vulnerabilities in American supply lines, fake schedules, misleading route information, all crafted to lure the enemy into a trap. The enemy fell for it completely. They repositioned their forces to ambush supply convoys that existed only in Samantha's carefully constructed fiction, while the real American logistics operation moved smoothly through routes the enemy had dismissed as decoys. In just 36 hours, 3 enemy positions were exposed and neutralized without a single American casualty. The true victory, however, came through intercepted enemy communications. Panic seeped into their words. Where is she? How is she doing this? Our intelligence was flawless, and yet Fox Echo 6 has turned it against us again. Pull back. We're fighting a ghost. When the operation concluded, Colonel Hayes gathered the entire unit for a debriefing. The room was filled with soldiers, including Morrison and his team, who stood at attention, their earlier arrogance replaced by a newfound respect. Hayes's voice carried a commanding weight as he addressed them. For the past 8 months, you've been working alongside one of the most brilliant strategic warfare specialists in American military history. Samantha Tran volunteered to serve in anonymity without the recognition or respect her service record deserved. She requested assignment here under the guise of a logistic clerk because she wanted her knowledge and skills to be judged on their own merit, not her reputation. Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with shame. The cocky young officer who had once dismissed the supply girl now stood humbled, grappling with the weight of his misjudgments. Samantha Tran, a 38-year-old Vietnamese-American logistics clerk, carried a secret heavier than the stacks of paperwork she processed daily. Once known as Fox Echo 6, a brilliant special operations strategist, she now blended into the mundane rhythm of base life, her past buried beneath a quiet demeanor. Around her, the base buzzed with soldiers who saw her as little more than a civilian paper pusher, until the day her carefully guarded identity unraveled, shifting their perceptions forever. Lieutenant Morrison, a brash young officer with a knack for underestimating those without visible rank, had been the loudest in dismissing Samantha's suggestions. His smirks and offhand comments had stung, but she'd borne them with the patience of someone who'd faced worse. Colonel Hayes, the commanding officer, had been the first to glimpse the truth when mysterious transfer papers crossed his desk, hinting at Samantha's hidden expertise. Sergeant Rodriguez, meticulous and observant, had quietly cataloged every tactical gem she'd let slip in casual conversation. Private Chen, a curious soldier with a penchant for digging, had spent late nights poring over declassified archives, piecing together fragments of a mission called Operation Recurve 17. Sergeant Martinez, eager and earnest, had watched Samantha's hand-drawn maps with growing fascination, sensing there was more to her than met the eye. And then there was the unnamed civilian, a high-ranking official whose arrival with a battered briefcase would stir memories Samantha had long tried to leave behind. In a briefing room thick with tension, Morrison stood, his face flushed with regret. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology I don't even know how to put into words," he said, his voice low. "Every time I brushed off your advice, every joke I made, I was a fool." Samantha's eyes softened, her tone gentle but firm. "You were a young soldier, Lieutenant. Young soldiers stumble. What matters is whether you grow from it." She scanned the room, meeting the gazes of soldiers whose skepticism had melted into awe. "I didn't conceal who I was to trick anyone. I did it to show you something vital. True skill doesn't need medals or titles to prove itself. It shines through steady competence and sound decisions." Colonel Hayes gave a nod of quiet approval, his stern features softening. "From this moment, Sergeant Tran will serve as our strategic operations advisor. But more importantly, let this be a lesson. The most formidable threats and the greatest allies are often the ones you least expect." The meeting ended with a gesture that hadn't occurred in the 8 months since Samantha's arrival. Every soldier in the room rose, saluting her in unison, their faces reflecting newfound respect and a deeper understanding of what that salute meant. The next morning, the mess hall's atmosphere had shifted entirely. Where once Samantha had eaten alone, ignored or overlooked, now conversations hushed as she entered with her breakfast tray. Heads turned, not with suspicion, but with admiration. A young private leapt to his feet, offering her his seat at the central table, a small act that marked a seismic shift from months of isolation. Morrison approached her later, his steps hesitant, a carefully wrapped package in his hands. "Sergeant Tran," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of his earlier mistakes. "I stayed up last night making this for you. It doesn't erase how I acted, but I want you to know I see it now, what I was too blind to notice before." He unwrapped a set of professional cartography tools, precision pens, measuring instruments, high-quality map paper, and a sturdy field compass. The equipment wasn't cheap. It was clear he'd dug deep into his own pockets. Since you've been sketching tactical maps by hand, I thought you might want tools that match your skill, he said, avoiding her gaze. Samantha inspected the set, her fingers tracing the smooth edges of the instruments. For the first time since arriving, warmth flickered across her face, softening the guarded lines of her expression. These are top-notch, Lieutenant. Professional grade, thank you. Her voice carried a sincerity that made Morrison's shoulders relax, if only slightly. Others began to gather, each with their own quiet offerings. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, presenting a neatly bound notebook filled with detailed records of every tactical insight Samantha had shared over the months. His meticulous handwriting captured her offhand comments, turning fleeting moments into a manual of strategy. Private Chen, eyes bright with discovery, handed her a stack of printed documents. Declassified files on Operation Recurve 17, outlining her role in strategic deception tactics that had turned the tide of a critical mission. I dug into the archives, Chen said almost shyly. I thought you'd want to see what they kept. Sergeant Martinez, hovering nearby, spoke up with a mix of hesitation and eagerness. Sergeant Tran, could you teach us your terrain analysis techniques and that route planning method you used? We want to learn it right this time. His words carried the weight of someone who'd glimpsed a master at work and hungered to understand. Before Samantha could respond, Colonel Hayes entered, accompanied by a civilian whose presence seemed to shift the air in the room. The man, clearly someone of significant authority, carried a worn briefcase. He approached Samantha and set down a small, tarnished object, a battered wristwatch, its crystal cracked, its hands frozen in time. We thought you might want this back, the civilian said softly. Your field chronometer, the one you turned into a compass when GPS failed during the Kandahar extraction. It saved 17 lives that day. Samantha stared at the broken timepiece, her composure faltering. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, her thumb brushing over the fractured crystal. I never thought I'd see this again, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I left it behind when that operation went dark. You left a lot behind when you vanished, the civilian replied, his tone gentle but heavy with meaning. But some things belong with those who earned them. Later that afternoon, Samantha stood alone at the base's memorial wall, where names of fallen soldiers were etched into black granite. At the bottom, almost hidden, was a section for classified operations, where names were withheld for national security. She traced her fingers over the smooth stone, her thoughts drifting to battles fought in shadows, to lives saved and lost, and to the weight of a past she'd carried in silence. The chronometer, now tucked in her pocket, felt like a tether to that hidden history, a reminder of who she'd been and who she still was. Samantha Tran's hands rested lightly on the smooth, unmarked stone, its cool surface grounding her in the moment. She traced the empty spaces where no names were carved, whispering softly, "We're still here." Her words were for comrades whose sacrifices would never be etched into stone or spoken aloud, their victories buried in the shadows of history. She stood alone at the memorial, a quiet figure carrying the weight of battles that would never make headlines. Behind her, the crunch of boots on gravel announced the arrival of Lieutenant Morrison and his squad. They had followed her, unbidden, to this sacred place. Now they stood in perfect formation, their salutes crisp and unwavering. But this time their gestures held something deeper than protocol, something born of newfound understanding. They weren't just honoring her rank or reputation, they were acknowledging the silent burden she had carried for years, the kind of service that demanded everything and offered no glory in return. Samantha Tran, a 38-year-old Vietnamese-American logistics clerk, was a ghost in the records of heroism. To the world, she was a woman who shuffled papers and coordinated supplies. But to those who knew her as Fox Echo 6, she was a strategist whose mind had turned the tide of battles. Her story was one of quiet precision, of decisions made in the dark that saved lives in the light. She never sought the spotlight, never craved the medals that adorned others' chests. Her victories were the kind that lingered in the minds of enemies, not the ones celebrated by allies. The soldiers who stood before her now had begun to grasp this truth. The greatest warriors often fought unseen, their impact felt in the outcomes they shaped, not the praise they received. Lieutenant Morrison, young and brash, had once dismissed her. To him, authority came with visible markers, stars on shoulders, ribbons on uniforms. Samantha, with her unassuming title and quiet demeanor, didn't fit his image of a leader. His mockery hadn't been cruel, just misguided. He'd been conditioned to value the trappings of rank over the substance of expertise. But standing at the memorial, watching her pay silent tribute to the fallen, he began to see his error. Samantha's warnings about ambush points weren't boasts of tactical brilliance. They were calculated efforts to keep her team alive. Her ability to sketch supply routes from memory wasn't a performance. It was the product of a mind honed by the high stakes of failure. Morrison was learning a lesson no military academy could teach. True competence didn't announce itself with fanfare. It revealed itself in steady judgment, in solutions others overlooked, in the quiet resolve to do what was necessary. The soldiers around him, Sergeant Rodriguez, who had pored over Samantha's tactical notes with growing awe, Private Chen, who had dug into the classified files of Operation Recurve 17, Sergeant Martinez, who soaked up her terrain analysis techniques like a sponge, had come to see her for what she was. Not a clerk, but a mastermind who had outwitted adversaries while her own colleagues underestimated her. Even the unnamed civilian official, who had quietly returned her old field chronometer, a battered relic from her days as Fox Echo 6, knew the truth. That broken timepiece, once used to save 17 lives through sheer ingenuity, was more than a memento. It was a symbol of a mindset that thrived when systems failed, when technology faltered, and when the only tools left were knowledge and grit. Samantha's life was a testament to the power of understated service. She had never appeared on news broadcasts or stood at podiums to recount her deeds. Her name would never grace history books. Yet for those who had seen her tours, those who had witnessed the fear in an enemy's eyes at the mere mention of Fox Echo 6, her legacy was undeniable. Her strategies had dismantled threats with surgical precision, her decisions saving lives while others debated protocol. The enemy had known her name, not because she sought their attention, but because her results were so devastatingly effective, they couldn't forget her. True reputation, she had shown, wasn't built on self-promotion or polished credentials. It was forged in outcomes so powerful that even adversaries carried the memory years later. This was the uncomfortable truth Samantha's presence revealed. People are quick to honor authority when it comes with obvious symbols, but slow to recognize genius when it wears the guise of ordinary service. How often in military life or beyond do we overlook the quiet experts among us? How often do we elevate the loudest voices, those with the biggest titles or the most visible accolades, while ignoring the ones whose contributions actually shape the outcome? Samantha's story challenged that instinct. Her enemies had understood her worth long before her allies did, fearing her tactical signature more than her colleagues valued her presence. That kind of impact couldn't be taught in training manuals or earned through rank. It came from a rare ability to see what others missed, to act when others hesitated, to prioritize results over recognition. The broken chronometer now resting in her hands was more than a relic of a single mission. It embodied a philosophy. When the tools of war failed, the true warrior relied on wisdom, experience, and adaptability. In a world obsessed with technology, Samantha's ability to improvise under pressure was a reminder that the most reliable asset was a well-trained mind. Her service wasn't about applause or medals. It was about purpose. She fought for the safety of those who would never know her name, never understand the sacrifices she made, never grasp the complexity of the strategies that kept them secure. That kind of duty didn't demand recognition. It demanded only resolve. As the soldiers stood in silent tribute, Morrison's eyes lingered on Samantha. He was beginning to understand what set her apart. The greatest warriors didn't fight for fame or glory. They fought in the shadows, where the real battles were won, where destiny was shaped not by the loudest voices, but by the quiet ones who kept the world turning.